All right, well, let's get started. Good morning and welcome to the Planning Green Stormwater Infrastructure in a Changing World, hosted by the MACC Area Coordinating Council. My name is Tyler Kent. I'm the Executive Director of the MACC Area Coordinating Council. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded this morning. The recording will be posted on the MACC website. So if you miss a portion of the presentation, please go back and watch the video. PDFs of the presentation will also be posted on the MACC's website. If you indicate that you need PDHs, a certificate will be emailed to you after the seminar. Your feedback is important. Please take a few moments to complete the survey that will be emailed you after the seminar today. Please use the chat feature to interact with the panelists and other attendees. Note that the default is set as a send message to only panelists, so be sure to change this if you want your message to be sent to the other participants. Go ahead and use the chat feature now to introduce yourself and tell everyone where you are from. So we'll wait a minute for you all to do that. Morning, Susan. All right, use the question and answer feature to ask questions of the panelists. Questions will be read out loud, if appropriate, during the question and answer time at the end of the presentation, or to answer maybe directly sent to you. We want to thank our sponsors for today's seminar. You will be hearing from them later today in the program. Our gold sponsors are Kennedy Solutions, Inc. and Advanced Drainage Systems. Our silver sponsors are Prine and Nienhoff and the Grand Valley Metro Council. I want to thank all of our sponsors again. Just a little bit about the MACC. The MACC Area Coordinating Council was established in 1993. We are a metropolitan organization, planning organization. Our local decision body carries out transportation planning, as well as other initiatives that the community sees the MACC playing a role in. We also manage and have oversight of the MACC Watershed Project that was established in 1999, and this is our 4th year hosting this event. First time doing it virtually. We are now going to do a quick poll question to get the sense of the audience. Please take a minute to respond. What type of work related to GSI do you do? We will share those answers with you shortly. Feel free to comment on those results. All right, so let's get started. This morning, the first presenter that we have today is Dr. Donald Carpenter. He's a professional engineer and accredited green design professional whose expertise includes green stormwater infrastructure, stormwater best management practices, hydraulic modeling and design, and community engagement. Dr. Carpenter has 25-year+ experience working with diverse clients across the United States as a researcher and practicing professional. His efforts have focused on researching innovative stormwater management practices and designing GSI retrofits for nonprofit organizations and local municipalities. Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Tyler. Appreciate it. So I'm very happy to be here today. We've done a couple different tests of this system so far, but in case anybody can't hear me or eventually can't see my slides, obviously just let me know either through the chat box or through the MACC. So with that, I have quite a bit of content I'm going to try to get through today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video and start my presentation. All right. Always takes a second for it to catch up. Okay. So maybe I can get confirmation from Kelly or Robert or somebody, make sure you guys can see my screen.
Everything looks good, Don.
Oh, looks good. Perfect. Thank you. So I'd also like to take an opportunity to introduce Rachel Piszek. Rachel is a professional engineer with Drummond Carpenter out of the Traverse City area, and she helped me a lot with this presentation as well as a lot of the design implementation I'm going to show you. So the title is a huge mouthful, right? Integrating climate change impacts into GSI design for improved resiliency. So really what I'm going to do with this presentation is I'm going to unpack that. I'm going to spend some time talking about climate change and the influence of climate change. That alone could be a 30-minute presentation, so I'm not going to go into that much detail. Given the title of today's workshop, and this is one in a series that the MACC has put on, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about green stormwater infrastructure, but because we're virtual and we have participants kind of from around the Great Lakes Basin and as well as the United States and Canada, we thought we'd just do a quick overview of what GSI means to us and give some quick examples. So when I say rain gardens, where I say infiltration trench, we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about resiliency and what it means to be resilient. And then finally, how do you actually modify GSI design to get the resiliency you want? So green stormwater infrastructure can help build resilient communities, but then in turn, we need to modify our GSI design so that in itself is resilient to changing situations. And then finally, there'll be about 5 minutes for Q&A at the end. So let's start with climate change. Some people in the call probably have a lot of knowledge and experience on this, but others may not. So I'm just going to kind of give you a couple highlights with that, right? So let's first talk about increased temperatures. So we're mostly interested in the Great Lakes Basin and the state of Michigan around here. But in a nutshell, the mean temperature of the past 100 years has gone up anywhere from 1 to almost 4 degrees in the state of Michigan. So interestingly enough, as you can see from the little chart right there, southeast is actually getting a little cooler. So Mississippi and Alabama is a little cooler than it might have been, but most of the United States has seen an increase in temperature. We've definitely seen an increase in precipitation, and many of you experienced that. We'll get to that on the next slide. But in addition to the overall increase in temperature, increase in precipitation, what's more important probably, or as important, are the extremes. Longer periods of drought, longer, more extreme weather events. So it's not just the averages, it's the extremes that are affecting us. And overall, we're actually seeing less Great Lakes ice cover, and that has various influences or effects on our microclimates in the state of Michigan. So what about increased precipitation that's been observed? Well, basically over the last 100 years, we've seen the average annual precipitation go up about 16%, so almost 5 inches. But this is not distributed evenly, right? What's really happened is our falls have gotten quite a bit wetter. So you're seeing that 24% increase in fall precipitation when you look at the 4 seasons. And I think the other thing, remember we talked about more extremes, the 4 wettest days of the year have increased by 35%. So they're a third greater. So our wet days are wetter than they used to be in the past 100 years. So that's observed, that's statistics, right? Well, you also have people looking at predictions, looking at different climate models and saying, well, what's going to happen to precipitation in the future? And so if you look at the mid-century, so like roughly around 2050, there's a low carbon emission cycles and high carbon emission cycles. And these are averages based on a whole bunch of different computer climatic models. And basically what they're saying is that by the mid-century, you're going to see about 10%, an additional 10% increase in rainfall in the next, basically the next 20 years or so. And then by closer to the end of the century, it's going to be anywhere from 15 to 20%, depending upon emission models. Okay? What does that really mean? Basically, it means that in the next 20 years, we're going to see the same amount of precipitation increase that we've seen in the last century. So it took a century for the additional rainfall to get to us. Now, in a matter of decades, we're going to see the same amount of increase. So we've got more water coming our way. So what does that really mean for us? In that case, it's flooding. I thought this is a picture from Midland. This picture actually became famous, I'd say a couple weeks ago, not this exact picture, but this site when the dams failed, right? And I'm not saying that the dams failed because of climate change, but I thought it was somewhat interesting that this exact location and this exact image was used in 2015 to look at flooding on the Tittabawassee River. And they pretty much had cameras set up at the same location for the dam failure that happened this year. But it's not just about like these extreme events. The Great Lakes basins are really high. So this is Lake MACC in the background there in the city of Holland. And so you have standing water. Basically, you have coastal flooding, and the coastal flooding isn't always even associated with rainfall events. Sometimes it's due to rising Great Lakes levels, and sometimes it's due to satiation or movement of weather patterns where wind will blow water up into our communities. What about air pollution and human health, right? So we're obviously, not only do we have additional precipitation, we have higher temperatures, right? And so actually in the last couple of years, we've set records for consecutive 90-degree days. So, you know, we don't have a lot of 110 and 115 degree days in Michigan like other places do, but we're cracking 90 with a lot more consistency than we ever have. So those high temperatures, that influences human health. People that don't have air conditioning or people that are in urban climates where even though the air temperature is 90, maybe there's microclimates where it might be real feel 100, 110. So you also have droughts, and so that's also influencing our crops, right? But in addition to the high temperatures, what happens with that is you actually see an increase in ozone, and people will hear about ozone action days. They may not understand what that means, but basically when you have really high temperatures, you have additional ozone, and that ozone can cause human health issues again from respiratory breathing. So the temperature has a role, the ozone has a role, but in addition to that, you can actually have crop failure. So too much ozone will actually influence the ability of plants like photosynthesize. And so the one on the left is a healthy plant, and the one on the right is basically the same crop after it's been exposed to high ozone action days. So it's not just the temperature, also the ozone that affects us. What about climate change in terms of ecosystems and plants? And I can't take credit for this image. This is about a decade ago, a climate scientist kind of came out where they took different, to try to make it easy for people to understand. They said, well, what will your climate be like in the future? So they took the state of Michigan and they looked at like a 30-year window and then said, okay, in the mid 21st century, what would your climate look like? And unfortunately, I obviously am from Michigan, and like a lot of national researchers do, they just got rid of the Upper Peninsula when they did the rest of their mapping. So my apologies to the Upper Peninsula, but it was not my decision to leave you off of this chart. But what this is really saying is that by the mid 21st century, our climate will be similar to Cincinnati, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky for now. And then if in high emission scenarios where you have a lot of carbon, the models are saying that we're really going to be more like Missouri and possibly even Oklahoma in the future. And so as somebody who grew up in Michigan in the 70s and then traveled to Cincinnati, Ohio to visit my relatives at the time, I can tell you that the summers in Michigan and Detroit now feel like the summers of Cincinnati, Ohio did in the 1970s. So I can actually see where this image is helpful. So what does that cause, right? It's a shift in ecosystems and patterns. We're starting to see loss of birch, spruce, and aspen. So a lot of our northern Michigan forests affecting the cold water fishing habitat that we have in the state. And in reality, even though there's more to it than just the simplicity of this, but we've actually lost the cherry crop 3 times in the past 20 years. So there's also, it affects our agriculture. And I've really kind of covered this, but basically when you think about climate change, then you have all these economic impacts on top of that. It affects agriculture, more natural disasters, rising cooling towers. So all of these things are packaged into climate change, right? So that was kind of my about 8-minute introduction to climate change. So now let's do even a quicker introduction to green stormwater infrastructure. So I think that most of us really have that part well in hand, right? So in a nutshell, GSI is using natural systems to manage stormwater, right? And this is the definition set up by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So there's a variety of GSI techniques available to us, everywhere from rain gardens, permeable pavement, and native landscaping. And I'm just going to give you a quick few pictures of each so that we're all kind of on the same page when we talk about GSI. So bioretention cells and rain gardens. A lot of people use this term interchangeably, but really what it is a rain garden is kind of a small depressional feature. It tends to be a landscaping feature, a homeowner feature. It's something you can do site by site, lot by lot to capture and treat stormwater runoff. A bioretention cell is a real engineered system. It's going to have overflows and curb cuts and gray. It's going to support gray infrastructure on top. So a lot of the work I do would be really classified as bioretention cells. Planter boxes, planter boxes are familiar to all of us, but they can be integrated into a portion of a bioretention system as well. They can be above grade or they can be below grade. And so when you look at a bioretention stormwater planter, one of the keys here is you can actually have it open at the bottom so water can go straight through into the ground, or it can actually be sealed off and basically act like a concrete or tub or basin with plants in it. And then you'd have an under drain so it can bleed out. Street trees and tree box filters. So street trees themselves are a really great way to combat climate change and do interception of rainfall, but they're not the same thing as a tree box filter. A street tree is effectively going to only treat the water that it falls on it and it intercepts with its canopy. A tree box filter is where water will shed off of the surrounding landscape into a basin, and then that tree soaks that up, right? So you have street runoff that goes into a system, an engineered system, and then the tree is the only part of that system you see, but there's a lot of it underneath. Infiltration trenches and galleries. Basically, this is a situation where you have sheet flow going into a stone trench, and then that stone trench then infiltrates or exfiltrates into the area surrounding it. So this one particular example from Traverse City, you've got water that sheet flows into porous pavement, into the stone, and then can infiltrate into the ground and kind of feed the cedar trees next to it. And then it can be expanded into very large systems, so whole galleries of water being stored underground and then slowly bleed or leak into the area around it. Permeable pavements, we can have permeable asphalt, we can have porous concrete, or we can have concrete block pavers. And these concrete block pavers can vary from anything from having openings that grass can be planted so that the cars can park on top of it, to really decorative patios. But all of these have a similar situation where water flows through them into stone stored underneath. Vegetated roofs and walls, right? So you can have intensive, very large vegetated roofs, or you can have extensive vegetated roofs, which are really not meant for human consumption, but are really meant more for stormwater management as well as heating and cooling effects. And I like to say vegetated roofs instead of green roofs, because in reality, a vegetated roof can have a whole bunch of different types of plants on it. It's not always green. It can be brown, it can be orange, it can be very colorful. We can take that concept and we can turn it on its side, and we can have live walls. So live walls can be used for evaporative heating and cooling effects. They can be used in addition to planter boxes to capture and treat water. So it's a lot of similar properties to a vegetated roof, but kind of behaves in a different fashion. It's obviously mounted sideways and it's a little different design aesthetics to it. Rain barrel cisterns and water harvesting. So everywhere from a 55-gallon rain drum up to large-scale cisterns that can be used to either irrigation or for internal plumbing and flushing of toilets. And then finally, native landscaping and buffers, right? So taking turf grass and converting that to native landscapes, right? And taking what used to be turf grass and putting in natives, and this can help for ecosystem benefit, pollinator benefit, water quality benefits, and even aesthetics. Hi. So I'm trying to track my time here. I know I'm going relatively quickly, but we got about 15 minutes left. And now I want to get into the heart of this conversation, which is resiliency, right? So we talked about very briefly before the things that are concerned with climate change, right? The precipitation, the pollution, human health, ecosystems. So really, then when we think about resiliency, what you're really talking about is how do we address those things using green stormwater infrastructure? Okay. So this is probably the most engineering heavy slide I'm going to show, but I think it's important. I know not everybody on the call is an engineer. There's a lot of educators and planners on it. But when we look at mid-Michigan, and the numbers actually on the bottom are for Holland specifically. And let me explain what we're looking at. What we're looking at here is engineers will typically talk about a design event. They may say a 2-year event. They may say a 100-year event. You hear this on the radio all the time, or the TV whenever there's a flood. It was a 500-year event. I don't really, the problem with using events is it's a bit of a misnomer, right? The idea isn't that this event will only occur once every 10 years or once every 100 years. It's really a probability, right? So the idea is there's a 1%, a 10-year event really has a 10% probability of happening in a given year. So with probabilities, right, you could have two 10-year events in 1 year or two 25-year events back-to-back years, because it's all about probability. Okay. So now you've had a chance to read these numbers. What this is really saying is in 1992, the city of Holland, right? The 2-year event or what had a probability of occurring, 50% chance of occurring every year was basically 2.28 inches, or 2.3 inches, right? By 2020, that number has gone up to 2.6, so about 0.3 of an inch, right? And however, again, because this is based on statistics, then really there's also what we would call a range or a confidence interval. So while we think you have a probability of 50% of a 2.6 inch rainstorm happening in the city of Holland, in reality, with the confidence interval, it really could be a 3-inch event. So city of Holland could have a 3-inch event on average every other year, right? And then if you slide all the way over to the right, you can really see where this 100-year event, with statistics, you need more and more data to get more and more confidence on those larger events. And so we at the city of Holland has a 0.1% chance of having anywhere between like 6.8 and 9 inches of rain in a given year. So this is much more higher than it used to be. The other chart you see on here is basically about 90% of all events are 1 inch or less, and about 99% of all events are 2 inches or less. So while we do have these really, really extreme events, most of our rainfall still, 99% of our rainfall is still less than 2 inches. So what does this mean for green stormwater infrastructure? Well, green stormwater infrastructure typically is designed for the first 2 inches of rain. So if I do green stormwater infrastructure design to complement my gray stormwater infrastructure, I'm capturing and treating 99% of all rainfall events. In addition, if I am capturing and treating 2 inches of rain, now when you look at these numbers, right? Let's say the high numbers do happen, right? Then my gray stormwater infrastructure was designed for 5 inches of rain. If I layer 2 inches worth of design rainstorms of green infrastructure over top of the gray, I can get it to behave or perform better for those larger events, right? And so these are the last two things I want you guys to think about, right? And that's basically, if you look forward, what used to occur, only a couple of times in a century is now going to happen a couple of times in a decade. And for our gray infrastructure to continue to perform, we need to layer it with green infrastructure to keep the level of service it needs. So how are communities doing that, right? So these are a couple examples of some other communities. So the one on the left is the Menominee River in Milwaukee. So it took a huge portion of kind of old industrial areas that used to be around the Menominee River, and they turned it into a giant green belt, right? So they're having one area that can hold a lot of flooding and a lot of runoff from the city. The city of Nashville, each one of those green dots represents a green stormwater infrastructure practice. So they've got a combined sewer system like there is in Detroit. And so they're doing diffusive management. So they've just dotted the whole city with potential green stormwater infrastructure practices, right? And both of these can help with precipitation and regionalized flooding. So here's another example with the architecture firm that I'm working with, right? So these are kind of a dense urban area. All of this area down here, this beautiful parkland, this kind of natural looking parkland, this is all designed to flood during rainfall events. And so this barrier, this wall really becomes the defining area, right? So it's a little bit small on your screen, but effectively, when you have small events, the water just kind of settles into these bioswales and water features and infiltrates in the ground. So that the 2-year and 5-year events, you can still use the park. But for the 100-year event, this whole thing gets flooded. So instead of us building retention basins, stormwater basins that are only going to get filled to the top once every several decades or once every 50 to 100 years and have no other purpose, other urban areas are spreading that water out and making it so that the 99% of the time it's dry, it can be used by the population. So one of the things, so people talk a lot about green stormwater infrastructure and the influence it has on water quality, the influence it has on flooding. But another really, really important impact associated with it is really air pollution and human health. So if you look at, if you take temperature readings, right? And so on an 85-degree day, that asphalt could be 105 degrees. Actually, it could be 125 degrees. These are just the temperatures from this particular study of that day, right? The sidewalk, which is concrete, maybe a little cooler than the black asphalt. But even bare soil inside a rain garden was registering 90 degrees, so hotter than the air. So you still have some of that thermal effects. The vegetation, if you took one of those temperature guns that we're now getting very comfortable with because of COVID, a lot of people are getting our temperature taken when we enter buildings. The vegetation is cooler than the air, right? So having more vegetative canopy or having more vegetation on the ground can really diminish that urban heat island effect. In addition, it cuts down on the ozone. It purifies the air. It filters out particulate matter. It sequesters carbon dioxide. So not only are you cleaning and purifying the air, but you're reducing those temperatures, you're reducing the ozone, and you're having an extremely positive effect on human health, the more green space you can get inside of urban environments. I don't really have time to go into all the details associated with the co-benefits of green stormwater infrastructure, but when you think about a resilient community, what you're really thinking about is a community where people want to live, work, and play, right? So economic resiliency is part of this. And green stormwater infrastructure can increase the appearance and aesthetics of a community. It can help with traffic calming. And it's been shown to be good for the economy. You know, eco-friendly development, energy savings associated with heating and cooling, increased land bases. So you can have ecotourism. You can even have cottage industries around green stormwater infrastructure maintenance, right? And so it's really been shown to be good for the economy as well, which makes for a more resilient community. So the last third part of my talk is, okay, now we know that green stormwater infrastructure is good for resiliency and can help mitigate the effects of climate change. How do we actually modify the designs themselves so they are in turn more resilient? And so when you think about green stormwater infrastructure and what future climate change impacts might happen, it really falls around three things. Where am I going to put that green stormwater infrastructure? What is the setting going to look like? What are the design details of the cross-section going to look like? And how am I going to select plants that are going to work? And so I'm going to go through each of these three things in brevity, right? So first of all, let's talk about location and setting. And the easiest way to do that is to give you an example from a project we did with the Watershed Center of Grand Traverse Bay in the village of Northport. So this particular project, so Northport is at the tip of the Leelanau Peninsula off the Grand Traverse Bay. And this is what downtown Northport looks like. So you've got the marina on Grand Traverse Bay, and then you have a kind of a typical northern Michigan downtown. Right? And so the Watershed Center of Grand Traverse Bay got a grant to implement green stormwater infrastructure in Northport. And this is why. You look at the street here, it's extremely wide. There's actually no stormwater infrastructure in this community at all. So all the water from the top of the hill past that stop sign, when it rains, it comes shooting down this Naganaba street, no treatment, no capture, it goes right into the marina, floods the marina, causes water quality problems. And so they submitted a grant. And so in the initial design ideas, they were going to capture the water near the bottom in the marina, right? So some of the water was going to be captured in Naganaba Street, some of it was going to be captured in the marina itself. And there was nothing wrong with these plans, right? And this was a good idea. The issue is between when the kind of initial planning was done and when it got time to actually do the design, Grand Traverse Bay had already kind of come up. And this was like in 2017. And so there was only about 2 foot of clearance from the marina and the water table. So 2 foot of clearance is not enough to really get green stormwater infrastructure to work. In addition, since that time, the lake has come up another 2 foot, and you actually have standing water in this marina. So what did we do? Well, instead of having the plans for the proposal called for some green infrastructure on Naganaba Street and some debris in the marina, we just pulled all of that up from the marina into the street itself. And the Google Earth or Google Aerial actually captured us while we were doing construction, right? So we did tree box filters on the main street. We basically narrowed the street itself. We took asphalt out. We made larger pedestrian walkways. We put in a series of tree box filters in there and connected them with stone reservoirs. And then when we got to the place where the water table was high and was going to be a problem, we put in street trees. So what this looks like effectively, even though people walking don't see it, each of these trees is connected with underneath with stone reservoirs allowing for infiltration. So people up here are walking around enjoying their ice cream, and there's infiltration galleries underneath all of them. So let's talk about cross-section in detail. So here's another project we did with the Watershed Center of Grand Traverse Bay. And so we wanted to put in a bioswale in this marina. And so this is the existing condition here, and they wanted to make it more natural. And so the community wanted something that looked like a really nice bioswale or rain garden, But with the rising lake levels, we thought, well, it's probably going to behave more like native Michigan wetlands. So how do we go about facilitating community desires with high water tables and get this to work? So this was our initial cross-section, right? We had might be considered a very standard bioretention cell. We had 6 inches of ponding, 12 inches of bioretention soil mix. We had an overflow structure that when this thing filled up, it would overflow and head out to Lake Michigan. And then that was our initial idea. But then when we got a little closer, the water table was creeping up, as we just discussed, like what was happening. Then the water table was getting higher. And we found that the soil itself didn't have the infiltration capability that we wanted. So we put in an underdrain system. We said, okay, you know what? We're going to have an underdrain so that if the water doesn't get into the water table, it'll at least fill this up and go into the stormwater. Now, I started worrying about this more because this water table kept going up, and I was worried about this actually flooding this underdrain and putting more water. Basically, this underdrain and this convention pipe would actually act like a dewatering system for the groundwater around it. So we were worried about this becoming kind of soup. So we did some water, basically simulations to look at plant health. And on the left would be if it was performing the way you think it should, which would be 2 inches per hour infiltration, low methane, no water tables, right? And we ran a year's worth of simulation. Well, over half the water would recharge, only 11% would run off, and everything would work the way you think it should work, right? If I built this thing in 2015, here's how it should work. But when you have this high water condition, now all of a sudden, 70% of the water is rolling off anyway, because it's got no place to go into the ground. And when we start looking at this in a little more detail, we were worried about plant survivability. And so what we found is that under ideal conditions, you might have only had 60 hours of ponding a year. We were seeing that we were going to the thing was going to flood the very first rainstorm and stay flooded the entire year. And so if you did a 1-inch rainstorm, you'd actually have over 60 hours of flooding. And that's beyond what the plants could survive. So we needed to modify this. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's get rid of the underdrain. Let's have no ponding at all. And let's really treat this instead of like a bioretention cell. Let's treat it like that native Michigan wetlands that's going to have plants that can adapt to being wet and dry seasonally. So we completely changed the cross section because of this high water table. It made it more resilient in the future. So I've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to go through these last few slides pretty quickly. But what we decided to look at is how do we make these designs more versatile? So we started doing 2 things. We started doing one, an upturn elbow or a standpipe. So basically inside the catch basin, we connect the standpipe to an underdrain, and that'll set how much water is retained in the system, right? And then we made the catch basin itself modular plastic. So you can basically add 6-inch lips to this overflow structure, right? So this may be your standard design. You've got no high water table. You've got really good infiltrating soils. So this water will be retained and it'll eventually infiltrate into the ground, and you got 6 inches of ponding, right? And if you find out that it's infiltrating more than you think, or if it's a drier, you can actually add another 6-inch lip and have 12 inches of ponding instead. If you have a water table and you're not getting as much retention or infiltration capacity as you want, well, then you can lower that upturn elbow and shrink the retention zone and make sure your plants aren't too wet for too long. If the water table gets really high, now you can eliminate the ponding. And so make sure the plants don't suffer from mortality based on being too wet too long. So starting to basically adapt this GSI for changing events. And these are easy to modify. You don't have to rip out a concrete catch basin. Because they're plastic and because they're modular, you can easily modify this as time goes on. In addition, we started looking at putting like underground chambers in it. These could be like an R-tank system or basically a plastic system that allows for additional capacity storage. So just another way to add resiliency to these. And this also works with porous pavement, even though I spent a lot of time talking about bioretention. A similar concept would work with porous pavers, other than you don't want to have any ponding above the pavement. So the last topic is plant selection. I am a hydrologist. I'm a professional engineer. I'm not an arborist. I'm not a landscape architect. So, but I will tell you a few things as an example. There are some rain gardens that were done in Burke Park, New Baltimore. This is the 2015 picture. These are beautiful rain gardens, properly designed, properly instructed, proper selection of plants. Everything was beautiful. The issue was that between 2015 and 2019, Lake St. Clair came up like 5 feet. And that was not foreseen in 2015. And so now these rain gardens have kind of gotten flooded over time. And so now you basically have standing water in them, and you basically have invasive species coming in, and you have really just 2 plants. You lost a lot of the flowering plants. And so to try to learn from this moving forward, what we're looking at is, okay, how do we pick, oh, there goes my timer set off. That tells me I'm at my time limit. So what we started looking at then is, how do we take areas that are wet shorelines, and instead of maybe doing traditional rain garden design, how about we put in projects that, areas that are wet, let's go ahead and devote them to being wet and putting in wetland species and native plant species that can handle very different hydro periods. And that'll help dry out other areas. So you're basically changing recreational uses of some of these shoreline parks. And this is a project that we're working on with the tip of the mitt watershed up in Charlottesville. And then also looking at different plants, right? So how do you use native plants that have a wide range of hydro periods, and looking at how that might work. And with that, I am at my time limit, and I think Rob is going to help us facilitate questions.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And looks like we're doing okay on time. We do have a few questions here. I see one in the question and answer. Where was the example of the flood park located?
The flood park, is that, which park were they referring to? There's 2 parks I showed. One of them, I think, is, they're referring to this flood park. That's actually, that particular park is in Paris.
Okay.
But we're looking at doing similar things in the U.S. I can't really just talk about them too much right now. They're talking about this flood park, that's Milwaukee.
All right, and then I see another question here in the chat, Don, and I'm not sure if this was directed directly to you or if this was just kind of a general question here. In Michigan, and using MTF or federal funds, what GSI elements are considered eligible participating costs?
Can you repeat the question? Because I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it, but let me hear it one more time to make sure.
Sure. In Michigan, and using MTF or federal funds, what GSI elements are considered eligible participating costs?
Well, I mean, it's the 319 program, which would be federal funds directed through the state. All GSI elements are eligible. So I guess it probably depends upon, I'm not sure what MTF is. I apologize. But I know like TAP funding, which is transportation funding through cities, you can use GSI elements associated with that. So I think the nuance would be in which federal funding, but there's a lot of federal programs that will support the use of GSI in streetscapes.
All right, and I'm not seeing any more questions, so thank you, Don, for that.
Really, no more questions. All right.
Yeah, and I would I'd like to remind participants also, if you have a question throughout any one of these presentations, please feel free to type them into the question and answer boxes, and we will get to them as we continue. So at this time.
Sorry, can I say something real quick?
Sure.
I believe I acknowledged everybody as I was going through, but just in case. Oh no, looks like people had a hard time not hearing me.
Yeah, initially we had a few.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit choppy at first. It did clear up after a while.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. Hopefully it turned out okay on the recording. But I did want to actually, again, thank the MACC for allowing me to participate in today's events and being a real champion in green stormwater infrastructure design in West Michigan. And as I said, some of the examples I showed were also with nonprofit organizations. So the Watershed Center of Grand Traverse Bay, Tip of the Mitt watershed up in northern Michigan, as well as the Clean River Watershed Council. I just want to acknowledge the hard work that nonprofits are putting in to make green stormwater infrastructure and community resiliency more of a feature in Michigan. So thank you to those organizations.
Thank you, Don. And now we'll have a brief video from one of our sponsors, the Grand Valley Metro Council.
Hello and welcome to the 4th Annual Green Stormwater Infrastructure Seminar. Thanks to the MACC for hosting and for allowing us to take a few minutes to talk about our work. I'm Wendy Ogilvie, Director of Environmental Programs at the Grand Valley Metro Council. We also house the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds, known as ELGRO. We've been working with the MACC for many years, coordinating our stormwater and watershed work to develop programs and policies that are consistent throughout West Michigan. GVMC is currently working with the MACC on developing a sustainable watershed funding strategy, and we've been reaching out to other areas of the state and our partners, watershed partners, to get their input and support for this project. GVMC is also working with MS4 permittees, facilitating the permits and working with the communities as the new permits are being reissued by the state. We continue to implement and promote green infrastructure, specifically through our rainscaping program, which focuses on residential and small business properties throughout the watershed. So that's a little bit about Elgrow. Today we have something fun for you. We're going to be playing a trivia game, so we hope you'll play along with us. Here's how it works. We're going to have questions asked by different members of our team. So it'll be a chance for them to introduce themselves and also ask a question about their area of focus. So if you get the question right, write it down before the buzzer goes off and give yourself a point. And it is an honor system, so you have to keep track of your own points. But I'm going to check back after all the questions and see how everybody scored. So first off, here's Josh.
Freshwater mussels are very beneficial to the ecosystem. As filter feeders, they help to remove contaminants from the water column, and in addition, they help to stabilize substrate and are a vital food source for many species. Of these native Grand River mussels, how many species do you see?
In June and July of this year, heavy rains caused the Grand River to rise nearly 20 inches. Lumbermen took advantage of the high water to bring their logs downriver, where they were held by booms located above the rapids in downtown. But the logs broke loose and 150 million board feet of timber went tumbling down the river toward Lake Michigan. This event created one of the biggest log jams in U.S. logging history. Logs piled up and created a jam 30 feet deep and 7 miles long. In what year did the Great Log Jam happen in Grand Rapids?
Name this subwatershed that is located in 4 counties, Kent, Muskegon, Ottawa, and Newaygo, and has 29 miles of trout streams.
This type of infrastructure can be used for stream bank stabilization, restoration, and erosion protection solutions. What is the name for this wire cage filled with rock or stone that's used to create a permeable wall?
Can you name this Michigan native plant currently in bloom now?
Wow, what great questions. How'd you score? Well, even if you didn't have all the answers, hopefully you learned a little bit about the Lower Grand River watershed and some of the work that we do. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@elgrow.org. And we hope we can all see each other soon in person. But meanwhile, take care of yourself and others. And thanks again from all of us here at GVMC.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and the crew at Grand Valley Metro Council. I'll admit I got 0 right on that, but great video as always. Thank you. This time I would like to introduce Ryan McEnhill. Ryan is a principal partner and vice president of ENG, a multidisciplinary engineering firm with offices in Lansing and Grand Haven in Michigan. Ryan is an accomplished engineer with a broad spectrum of civil infrastructure and municipal engineering expertise, including roadway design, water distribution systems, stormwater management systems, sanitary sewers, and construction administration. Over the last 17 years, he has worked on hundreds of drain projects with county drain commissioners and water resources commissioners throughout the state of Michigan, and has administered site plan reviews for stormwater management in Muskegon, Ottawa, Allegan, Berry, and Oceana counties. Please welcome Ryan.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the introduction. I am primarily based in West Michigan, out of Grand Haven. I've been doing stormwater reviews in several of the counties around West Michigan for the past 5 years. So what I want to do with my presentation, obviously with the new stormwater rules being implemented, I wanted to just give you an overview of some of the critical elements, I guess, of the new rules. And then I wanted to get into some case studies that we've done over the past 5 years of projects that have worked well and kind of align with the stormwater standards and what we're looking to see. And then also case studies that have occurred that maybe didn't come out exactly as we wanted them to. So I think Don's presentation, which was great, is kind of a good segue into kind of what we're going to be talking about, which is primarily focusing on green infrastructure to try to treat stormwater at the source and not just, I guess, default back to let's put in these massive detention basins and just call it a day. So just to get into some of the background, Muskegon County actually was the first to implement these new stormwater rules. That was done back in 2016, and they actually had nothing to work with at that point. There were no stormwater standards at that point, so it just made sense for them to kind of transition into these stormwater rules. So that's kind of where I got my start doing stormwater reviews and implementing under these new standards. Ottawa, Kent, and Allegan are kind of moved into them a little bit later in the process. Kent County, from what I understand, previewing their website, looks like they published back in 2019. Ottawa County is looking to get theirs implemented in January 2021, and I think they have a meeting coming up in September where they're going to brief engineers kind of similar to this, probably go into more detail than I'm going to be able to do here in just 30 minutes. And then Allegan County, I guess I'm unsure when they're looking to implement as well. There are going to be some differences that you're going to notice. Each county did kind of tweak things a little bit. You know, for instance, Muskegon County for their flood control requirement is only at a 25-year rainfall event, whereas Ottawa County is looking to a 100-year rainfall event for flood control. So there are going to be some minor differences between each county and how they get published. So what are some of the goals of the new stormwater rules? Obviously, having a unified stormwater review procedure at the county level is important so that we're implementing things the same way across the board. And what's especially good in this case is that it's almost more of a regional approach because these counties in West Michigan are all going to be kind of following the same stormwater rules. So that's a key thing that I think is important. Compliance with the Land Division Act, that was formerly the Subdivision Control Act, which kind of sets the standards for land development. And then compliance with state and federal stormwater mandates. Most are familiar with the MS4 requirements. And those kind of hinge on the following things: is having a water quality treatment performance standard, which I think most are familiar with that type of standard. Channel protection performance standard, which I'm going to talk about here a little bit later. It may be new to some folks. A procedure for evaluating infiltration BMPs, and measures we can take to address hotspots. And hotspots are basically sites that have hazardous materials that may pose some dangers to either surface water or groundwater quality as well. So we want to make sure that we're taking measures to address those areas. And then long-term O&M plans as well, which, to be quite honest, has been a little bit challenging. You know, you can have a great design from a stormwater perspective, but if we're not following through 5 years, 10 years down the line to properly maintain these things, they're just not going to function the way that they're supposed to. And I think the challenge comes from making sure that your townships are on board with being able to implement agreements to make sure that long-term maintenance is taking place. So just an overview of the critical design elements with the rules. So soils investigation, I'm going to talk about quite a bit today because it's very important to stormwater design, and especially on the west side where we have a lot of sand and we're capable of using infiltration techniques. It's very important that we have that soils investigation. Water quality, first flush, which obviously contains the most pollutants. So we're trying to treat that water quality, and that's capture and treating runoff from the 90% annual storm, which is, you know, approximately 1 inch of rainfall. The channel protection for surface water discharges. This doesn't apply to retention basins, but it does apply to detention basins. And what we're trying to do is for the post-development runoff rate and volume, it shouldn't exceed the pre-development rate for volume and events up to the 2-year 24-hour event, which can be considered the bank full flood event. And what we're trying to do is the smaller, more frequent storm events that we're having have the greatest impact on stream morphology and erosion in streams. So we're trying to protect those downstream systems that we're discharging to. And then most are familiar with flood control. Obviously, this is required for all sites. As I mentioned, this may be 25-year event or 100-year, depending on which county your site is being developed in. And then pre-treatment for all retention and detention basin facilities is going to be a requirement on any site. So getting into some of the tools, we do have a stormwater calculator, and I know that Claire went through this in a lot of detail 2 years ago at this same conference and went through an example utilizing this spreadsheet, which is great. It's great for us as reviewers because we know how it works. It allows us to review things a lot quicker. This system or this calculator applies to detention systems only. So obviously a retention system, we're not going to have a channel protection requirement because we're not discharging to a stream. So this is primarily focused on detention systems only. And I think one of the things that I've noticed over these years doing the reviews is that it becomes obvious that a lot of the folks that are using this spreadsheet don't really understand, I guess, the background, the actual calculation that goes with the spreadsheet. And one of the things that we're trying to work with actually Claire on is if there's a way that we can, once people click on one of these cells, if they can see the actual formula and calculation that's going into what's getting spit out, so that everybody's aware of what those calculations really mean. It's certainly easy to plug in your numbers and just don't think about it, and just whatever it spits out, it does. And we want to get away from that so people are understanding everything that is entailed in that spreadsheet. So this is the soils investigation that is going to be required for all sites. And this was one of the things that we got pushback on early. Everybody wanted to default to the NRCS soil survey. They didn't want to spend the funds to go out and actually get geotechnical done, whether it's test pits or boring requirements. All of this stuff is critical to how infiltration is going to work at your site. So the highest known groundwater elevation, which is basically, obviously doing the soil pits, it's a visual indicator. What we're looking for is the modeling line or the seasonal high groundwater level, where that's a visual line in the soil where we can see where there's been prolonged standing water, so that we can design our systems based on those elevations so that they're most likely to succeed. Field permeability testing is a requirement. We're not gonna allow material to be taken in the field and go back to a lab and have it done that way. Obviously, we want it done in the field. A double ring infiltrometer, I think, is kind of the standard to get that done. Nothing can replace a field test as opposed to a lab test. And then the design infiltration rates really is the field rate divided by 2, which I think most are pretty familiar with. That's pretty common. And if it's not field tested, in some cases, there is a table that gives general infiltration rates as well, which usually are very conservative. So it usually makes the most sense for the stuff to be done in the field and do it early on, because it is a critical component of the design. So these are some of the photos that we've seen. Obviously, these were developments that were implemented before these new rules came into play. You can see a foundation there that's right next to a detention basin that is it's high groundwater. And what you fear is that, somebody, when groundwater levels were low, moves into that house, and now they've got a disaster on their hand later on because nobody took the time to do a soils investigation and see what that seasonal high water level was doing. And a lot of the comments that I've gotten, people that have done site plans and stormwater reviews for 20 years, indicating that, it's sand, it's fine, everything's going to infiltrate. And the thing is, I think spring 2020 kind of showed us that we had massive flooding over here from all the rainfall we got and high groundwater levels, completely devastated homes. And so what we're trying to do is mitigate all that right up front. Because ultimately what it does is it results in petitions to drain offices to come back and fix this stuff later at a much higher price tag. So that's why that soils investigation is so important. So now I'm going to get into to some of the case studies that we've found, I guess, going from an old school approach to a new school approach. Old school, let's build a large detention pond. Let's put in a conveyance system. Let's get it there as quickly as we can. And now we're trying to completely go away from that. We want to treat and infiltrate runoff at the source using a lot of the elements that Don kind of talked about in his presentation. Doing that and then maybe getting them to a central pond as a flood control mechanism as well. That picture on the right is actually a petition drain project that our firm worked on probably 15 years ago. It got implemented in East Lansing, kind of something that happened way ahead of its time. It wasn't as common as it is now, but completely retrofitted an older platted development to include all these rain gardens. We were able to utilize significantly smaller pipes to do that, and it turned out great. So it can be done. So this is something that you'll see this is the Lakes Mall actually, in Fruitport and Norton Shores. Again, kind of that old school approach. And what has happened over time is these systems, it's a high groundwater area for one. All of that discharge into these systems is carrying all that sediment and pollutants into these detention basins with it. And the bottom of these has completely silted shut, no longer able to infiltrate through the bottom. All it can do now is infiltrate out of the sides. And it's not uncommon for these to sit at these high water levels for months before they're able to recede. And then lack of maintenance is another big thing that is a concern. But there's a lot of things that could have been done with these very simply to make these more lasting and function appropriately. And so this is kind of the new school. This is what we're looking for under these new rules, where we can do things right at the source in the parking lot, bioswales, you know, curb cuts, things we can treat water quality right away. Perforated pipes, set flat, leach basins, anything we can do to handle stormwater on site and not discharge it to a stream is really what we're looking for. So going from the parking lot infiltration into maybe a regionalized detention basin, wetland construction, things of that nature to handle the flood control as well. This is kind of the gold standard for what we want to see. And honestly, it's been a struggle to get these implemented. We obviously know that there's, in some cases, developers just want, let's just do this, the simplest thing we can possibly do. And it does take a little urging, I think, on our end as engineers to try to push these things as much as we can, because it is important to the long-term health of our streams and our water courses. So there are some limitations to retention basins. And I want to go through these because these are the things that I guess we got into the most conversations with designers about, because it kind of threw them for a loop. And if we look at the rational method calculation, for instance, and you look at this paragraph here at the bottom where it says, you know, this method assumes a conservative infiltration rate of 0.5 inches per hour. And that value is used regardless of the soil type, based on the observation that retention basins fail most often due to the in situ soil being compromised and or over compacted. And so people had a lot of problem with that. They just thought, no, we've always been allowed to use half of our field tested permeability rates. Why are we changing this? And we can use half of the field tested permeability rates to meet our water quality, to meet our channel protection, but the actual flood control has limitations with it. So there's been a lot of pushback on that. I think that's one of the things that we've had to tell people is we can use those field tested rates for our water quality and channel protection, but the flood control has a different criteria. And it's definitely a conservative approach. Although when I do look at the conditions that we had this past spring, where basins were overflowing and things of that nature, I think it does have its merits, but designers should be aware of those requirements. And one of the things we've been trying to do, and we've worked with people, obviously there's rules, but there needs to be some flexibility too. And we want to focus on pre-treating so that we can protect the infiltration capability of retention basins as much as we can. So we're trying to avoid compromising, I guess, that infiltration capability. So there's three methods there that can be used for retention basins. I'm not going to go through all of them just because of the time constraints, but those are something that designers should pay attention to. So getting into a couple case studies, this is one that just occurred in Norton Shores. And I'm going to actually just skip ahead one, because if you look at that photo and then look at the photo of kind of what we want the wet detention basin example to look like, it pretty much meets that to a T. We want upstream infiltration measures taken, upstream BMPs, whether that's leach basins or perforated pipes or curb inlets with bioswales and things of that nature. We have our sediment forebay in place to be able to filter out some of that sediment so we can focus our maintenance techniques in those areas. This was a high groundwater table area, so there was the opportunity potential to utilize the side slopes in some fashion for infiltration, being that we had sandy soils. And then this actually had an extended detention outlet. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but everything is focused on infiltration, has to be the ¡1 goal on any site. We want to infiltrate as much as possible. And if it can't be met, then there's an alternative approach that I guess needs to be requested, and the designer needs to provide justification for why they think an alternative approach needs to be taken. And what we run into mostly is just groundwater. It's very high in some locations, and so we have to go to an alternative approach, and maybe that's a multi-orifice design. Something of that nature is the most common. So this is a case study in Fruitport, Michigan that maybe didn't go exactly how we wanted it to. We had many discussions with the designer about this project. Fruitport is known for high groundwater levels. They wanted to try to manipulate those groundwater levels by having various ponds. And we had concerns very early on. We had several meetings. They did a very thorough soils investigation, but in this case, since they were going to be manipulating groundwater levels through these ponds, they also did a hydrogeological study as well, which I think was a good thing to do, but they wanted to try to utilize infiltration as much as they could, but we just didn't think it was going to be possible on this site. And you see these ponds, there's forebay areas there, and you can actually see the overflow structure underwater in those. Those pre-treatment basins were supposed to infiltrate completely so that you could see the bottom. And after this was implemented, they were staying at those levels for months and months and months. And what that ultimately ended up happening was now we're getting continuous discharge to a natural stream, which goes against our channel protection and everything else. So I guess this is one of those that didn't work out how the designer envisioned it to. And ultimately they had to come back because it was a 433 drain that was now being taken over by the county. They had to actually come back and go to an extended detention design that we were assured that was going to meet the channel protection requirements being achieved. And for channel protection, we want to completely store and infiltrate that difference in the post to pre-development 2-year 24-hour runoff event. So this is one that didn't go, I think, how they wanted to, but ultimately, I guess, at the end of the day, we got what needed to be done. So this is another case study up in Montague, Michigan, a commercial development. The designer, well, first of all, let me back up. They did do a soils investigation, great soil, great sand, very good depth to the groundwater table. This is a golden site where we should be using infiltration 100%. The initial submittal is they have a forebay, but they have a control structure, set their orifice at the bottom, just like the good old days, and they're sending stormwater off site. So we came back with our review letter, obviously, water quality, channel protection. There's no reason that we can't store and infiltrate that amount. So they went back to the drawing board, were able to make the corrections right away. But I think I just want to reiterate, because it's so important with these standards, that infiltration is what we're looking for as much as possible. So they modified that and we were able to meet the intent of the standards, but it took one more iteration for the designer that probably could have been avoided. So I think this is my last slide. I'm a little bit ahead of schedule. And just an overview of the design elements. Again, soils investigation, make sure that we're doing that right up front. It has to be done. We're going to focus on infiltration as much as we can. We want to protect our streams as much as we can. So don't try to skirt by that, because that is something that we're going to look for 100%. Do BMPs in the parking lots as much as possible. Use your imagination. There's a lot of tools out there. We list a lot of tools in the stormwater rules that can be used. So try to be creative. I know, breaking old habits can be tough, but that's what we're looking for as much as we can. Already focused on the infiltration, I guess, as your first design tool. The other thing that we've noticed, or what we want to have happen, is do the best you can to protect the infiltration capability, especially so in retention systems, but even in detention systems as well. Anything we can do to protect that infiltration capability is going to be better long-term for the maintenance and function of our systems. So that's all I had today. More than happy to answer any questions.
All right, well, thank you, Ryan. And we do have a question here from Kara Decker at Elgro. Ryan, can you please give us a general ballpark for the cost difference between using a traditional detention design versus a green infrastructure design?
Right, and that's a good question. I think going back to that example that I used with the rain gardens that we did in East Lansing for the Ingham County Drain Commissioner. I mean, they did extensive studies on techniques like that. That was actually a net reduction in cost. Maybe we're using 8-inch to 12-inch perforated pipes as opposed to, a 36-inch diameter concrete going down through the roadways is obviously a reduction in cost. I think the biggest hangup is developers and the owners are leery of the maintenance costs that go along with a rain garden, for instance. I think that's one of the things that they just don't want to mess with, that we kind of have to keep pushing towards. It is probably cheaper to install, but they're worried about the long-term impacts. And I think that's to be determined. I guess the more we do it, the more efficient we can be at maintenance and that moving forward. But I guess other than that, I don't have a great, I know people argue it either way. I think at the end of the day, it's probably pretty similar, but the long-term benefit with infiltration BMPs is a lot greater.
All right, great. Thank you, Ryan. I want to also encourage participants, if you've noticed, there's been some conversation in the chat with panelists and presenters, so feel free to engage with them there also if you do have some questions. At this time, we're going to start another quick video from one of our sponsors, from Prine and Newhoff. For 50 years, Prine and Newhoff has been meeting the infrastructure needs for townships, municipal, and private clients across West Michigan. At Prine and Newhoff, their goal is to serve their clients wisely with a combination of experience, integrity, creativity, and common sense. For the project in this short video, Dana Bird, who is an engineer at Prine and Newhoff, worked with Joe Bush, the Ottawa County Water Resource Commissioner, and Melanie Mannion, the Natural Resource Supervisor at Ottawa County Parks, on a collaborative effort to provide both flood benefit to area residents and habitat improvement to a public park property in transition. This project turned out better than imagined, as the native vegetation continues to reestablish. More and more interesting plant species, reptiles, and amphibians, and birds are emerging in the area. And over the last year, which has been the wettest on record, the drain has been working double time to provide flood benefit to the area. Enjoy this video, and remember, much of this is a public park that anyone can go explore and enjoy. thank you to Brian and Newhoff for that video and for that sponsorship. Also want to go back here a second. I see there were a few questions in the chat that we missed. Ryan, if you're willing and able, maybe we can address one of these questions here. One of the questions that came in, what is a good way to start conversations with local communities on the benefits of incorporating these systems?
Yeah, so I think as soon as I mean, the sooner the better, right? And I think it does take a lot of help from the township, or being the township and the drain commissioners, I guess, being in unison on these techniques. The townships, you know, especially with the maintenance stuff, and even cities and villages have been hesitant to follow through, like on the maintenance aspect, making sure that those get executed. So I think the sooner the better, if you're able to talk to those folks and give them the rationale and basis for why these elements are so important. And especially, you know, with us being on the west side of Michigan, where our lakes, the Great Lakes, obviously are so important to our way of life. If we can convey that to them and get them on board, it really is a huge benefit.
Thank you, Ryan. And then there's one other question here. Has there been any discussion with municipalities about giving rain garden credit for meeting landscape requirements? This may help property owners implement some rain garden design.
So no, not that I know of. You know, maybe something on a little bit of a different level that we are doing when we do like a drain project, for instance, where we're assessing property owners. If somebody is doing, and maybe this is a farmer that has a vegetative buffer strip, or a property owner that has a rain garden or rain barrel in their yard, reducing their assessment because they are doing measures on their properties that are directly improving stormwater quality, are things that can be implemented. Beyond that, in communities themselves, I haven't seen it happening, unfortunately.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Thank you for coming back to address those questions. We are doing okay on time at the moment. So at this time, I would like to introduce Kelly Goward. Kelly Goward is the Environmental Program Manager here at the MACC. Kelly has been with the MACC since August 2012, working with local stakeholders to improve the water quality of Lake Macatawa and the overall health of the Macatawa watershed. Prior to working with the MACC, Kelly worked with the Ottawa and Allegan Conservation Districts for 8 years, assisting landowners with forest and wildlife management, critical dune issues, water quality, using native plants, and controlling invasive species. Kelly holds a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Grand Valley State and a Master's of Science in Natural Resource and Environmental Management from Ball State University. Please welcome Kelly Goward. Kelly, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. I've been on top of everybody else for that, but thanks, Rob. Before I get into the presentation, I do want to kind of just go back and add on to that last question there. Carrie Rivette from the City of Grand Rapids commented in the chat box. And I will also say we work with the communities in the Holland-Zeeland area, and the City of Holland is working on updating some of their landscape ordinances, incorporating more green infrastructure. So I think those conversations are starting to happen, but we do have a ways to go there. So the focus of my talk today is kind of following what Ryan is talking about. He mentioned the importance of operation and maintenance and having a plan for that, including you know, the accounting for the costs of operation and maintenance. So what I am, going to talk about today is some background of how this came to be, this guide that we developed. We'll go into the components of the guide, step through some of the contents, and talk a little bit about how you would put an operation and maintenance plan together for private stormwater BMPs, and then share some of the forms and templates that we created. So a little bit of the background, how this came to be. So in Ryan's presentation, he talked about the post-construction runoff control. Those are the stormwater development rules were written to meet that requirement of the NPDES stormwater permit, or MS4. So those are required in urbanized areas. So we work again with the Holland Zealand urbanized area, but the Grand Rapids urbanized area, Kalamazoo, Muskegon, Ann Arbor, and so on, are subject to these requirements. So within the stormwater permit, one of those sections in the permit is the post-construction runoff control. So how is stormwater going to be managed after we're done with construction on a project? And the permit from the state of Michigan requires that there be some kind of accommodations for long-term operation and maintenance of stormwater controls on private sites. And this is for anything that would be subject to site plan review at the local level. And part of ensuring long-term operation and maintenance is having a maintenance agreement in place with that local municipality. And a maintenance agreement is only as good as the plan that's behind it. So then we put together a planning guide to help that developer, engineer, whoever it is that is designing a system or developing a property, to put a plan together to go with their maintenance agreement that would be recorded with the local municipality. So just some of the, how we developed this, how it came about, and, how we started to put the content together. Writing a plan, there are certain components that are fairly standard in all types of plan. So we go over those components that should be in a plan. We also provide some suggested language that can be used. And I work in a world where we do a lot of plans, so I'm used to that, but not everybody is. So we put together a template that hopefully is relatively easy to use and modify. It certainly doesn't have to be used, but we wanted to provide something. Also within the guide, we do refer back to the stormwater standards, these development rules that Ryan talked about. Within each county in West Michigan, within their rules, they provide a list of stormwater BMPs, both non-structural and structural. So our guide includes information about all of those. There's kind of a fact sheet for each practice that provides some basic information and kind of an overview of the maintenance needs. And we put those together as kind of one-page fact sheets that could be taken out as a separate sheet and inserted into an O&M plan. So you have that basic information about that BMP. And then we also put this kind of guide together, intending it to be inspection based, that your operation and maintenance, first and foremost and most importantly is that you're doing inspections, and then you are conducting maintenance based on what you find during your inspections. Hopefully that will help decrease the overall cost of maintenance, and then also help you identify problems early before they become larger and more costly to take care of. So we also did inspection checklists for each one of those BMPs that has a fact sheet for it. And then we do kind of emphasize the need for documentation, making sure those inspections are documented, that any maintenance that you do is documented. And then there's this difference between routine and corrective maintenance. And so there may be different ways that you would document all of that, but making sure that you have that documentation to prove to the local municipality that you are in compliance with your maintenance agreement. So the guide itself, there's a screenshot here. It is posted in its entirety on our website and available for anyone to use. We did kind of our target audience for this is really the municipalities in West Michigan that are using this kind of same standard development rules, but certainly can be used by anybody. So the various sections of the document, we certainly start with the background and purpose, list of definitions. First, we talk about the components of a plan, what should be included in your plan, and then we've got all those fact sheets on the non-structural and structural BMPs, and then all those inspection checklists. And then we do have quite a bit of supplemental information in appendices, some additional online resources to go to for more information about the various practices, about plan writing. We do have a plan template. It's actually in a Word document that you can download and modify however you want to. And then we did provide some other information about, if there's a spill, pollution leaves the site, what you should do about that. And these are certainly specific to Michigan regulations. And then some of the other kind of byproducts of maintenance, how do you handle those? So we've provided some of those guides for how to handle the waste associated with maintenance. And then we did provide kind of a sample maintenance record for keeping track of your maintenance, and then also a sample for how to evaluate your plan, because a plan is only as good as it actually works, so it's important to evaluate that plan and adjust it as necessary. And then we did provide some information about Michigan native plants. So we're going to step through each section briefly. Of a plan itself, not of the guide document. But when you put together a plan, so again, this is what we suggest that you do. Certainly, there are plenty of other ways to put a plan together. But again, kind of general components of a plan, starting with clearly stating your purpose. What is the goal and objectives of the plan? And even if it's as simple as, operate and maintain stormwater controls as designed, that it should be stated at the get-go. Including a description of the BMPs. What are the components of your stormwater system that you need to make sure are operating and being maintained properly? And again, that's where we have those fact sheets that could be included, or at the very least, a copy of the site plans or as-built should be included. So whoever is going to be responsible for the operation and maintenance knows where those BMPs are located. It's also important to identify the responsible parties, who is responsible for inspection and maintenance over the lifespan of the practice. So you might have some contacts for the people that are involved during the construction and then after construction. And then there should also be a process in there for how you update those contacts and notify the new responsible parties that they are responsible for taking over implementation of that plan. Next, we've got the maintenance. So what tasks should be completed and on what schedule. And again, really emphasizing the inspection schedule. And it's going to vary depending on the practice. Should they be inspected once a year, every time it rains, once a month? I mean, it really depends on the site and the BMP. And so beyond the regular inspections would be what routine maintenance needs to happen. So for vegetative practices, routine maintenance may be you need to mow once a year or once a month, or you need to irrigate for the first few years. So what are the routine maintenance that you're going to need to do regardless? And this is where the template, we had a little bit of a hard time trying to figure out how to make a fillable template, because I think the best way to do this is to summarize it in a table so it's very clear and concise and easy to read. But again, it's very site specific. If you have a treatment train of practices, that could be a fairly complex table. So it was difficult for us to figure out how do we put that in a plan template. So that may be something that you need to create within that Word document, as opposed to we already have something in there that you just fill in the blanks. We're still kind of evolving this process a little bit and what that plan template might look like. So beyond the actual maintenance scheduling, it's important to identify the waste handling procedures for both liquid and solid waste. So any of those maintenance spoils, how will those be handled? A section about record keeping. Are you going to use the inspection forms we provide? What inspection forms are you going to use? Where are those going to be kept? Who receives copies of those? And then other types of record keeping too, for your routine and emergency maintenance records. And I think it's also important to talk about photo documentation, what photos you want to have on file for the practices. Do you want photos every time an inspection is done, or only kind of before and after maintenance is completed? And then we do have a section that we encourage to be included about training. So training the person or people that will be responsible for actually doing the inspections and maintenance. So we've got some, some basic training recommendations just for health and safety, depending on the practice. Is there personal protective equipment that should be used when going out to do an inspection? Just depending on the BMP, if you're going to inspect a rain garden, maybe not. Maybe you just need gloves so you can pull weeds. But if it's more of an enclosed system, then maybe the specialized training is needed, and not just anyone can go out and do that inspection. Any training in the regulations and liability, especially as it pertains back to that maintenance agreement and your local municipality. Those are important for the operators of the systems to know. Any equipment that will be used for maintenance, and then certainly the maintenance techniques themselves, even if it's as simple as how to identify a weed and pull it out of a rain garden. It's important to provide that training. Also how to fill out the forms properly, the kind of the chain of custody of those forms, who receives them after the inspector does the inspection. Certainly the waste handling procedures. And then, we would recommend just some general training on stormwater pollution control, depending on the site. If it's, you're in an industrial commercial area, there may be some potential outside of your stormwater controls for pollution to enter them. So with lawn care practices, vehicles that might be leaking in the parking lot. So, and considering those kinds of things into your training as well. And then I think this is the last section in the plan, some kind of process for how you're going to evaluate and update the plan if needed. We recommend an annual review of the plan. So here's a look at some of the other components of the guide itself. So these are a couple examples of these kind of overviews or fact sheets of the practices. So we just provide a basic definition, some example photos. The gray box has some of the routine maintenance that you might conduct seasonally, and then a bulleted list of some of the typical corrective maintenance that might be needed, again, based on what you see during the inspections. And then, oops, one of my graphics didn't load. But so the inspection forms, if you noticed, like the bioretention rain garden, they are color coded to match. And so this, we tried to again, keep it as simple as possible, cram it all on one sheet. So there's not a whole lot of room here, but there are some various sections of this form here to kind of guide the inspector to certain components of the practice. And each one uses this rating system. 0 is in good condition. If you give it a 3, it's in serious condition. So there is some guidance as to what that means. What does good condition mean? What does serious condition mean? So if you go out and everything looks good, then you should rate everything a 0. If there are problems, they would fall within that kind of matrix of 1 to 3. And then again, we keep trying to keep it as simple as possible. We've got this columns here to record, what did you see? So what did you see that made you give it that rating that you did? And then what did you do? So depending on the situation, so if there's excessive trash accumulated at the inlet of the rain garden. Maybe it was given a 2, a degraded condition, but it was something that could be easily addressed during the inspection, so they picked up the trash. So this is a way that you can document your inspection, but also document any corrective actions that are taken at the time of the inspection. If you need to do corrective actions that have to happen later, that need to be scheduled or are more involved, then you can describe that at the bottom of the form here. And then it does reference taking photographs to document any of the deficiencies. Something else that might be useful during an inspection that it's not necessarily noted on the form here, but having a site plan available during the inspection, so especially if it's a complex site and there's multiple practices going on, so that right on the site plan they can identify where the problem is that they saw. Oh boy, okay, I see my graphics didn't load. So this was supposed to be a screenshot of the Word document. I think I'll have time, I can actually show you on the website where it's located and we can pull open that template. But within the plan template, there's the first page provides instructions for how to use the template. So anywhere that you see words in brackets, those are placeholders for you to insert the information specific to your site. Anything in italics are suggestions or instructions, and those are meant to be deleted, not to be left in your final plan. And then there's plain font that, we've provided some suggested language that you can leave it as is, it should be good to go, or you can modify it if needed. Oh, okay, so this graphic worked. So here's what we put together for, a form that could be used to document the maintenance. So fairly basic, who's doing it, where did you do it? And this does indicate to attach a site map. What BMP were you maintaining? What was the maintenance performed? Were you able to fix the problem? And then, there's some follow-up depending on how you respond to those. And again, very simple, but it's a way to make sure that there is that documentation on file. Okay, and so this was our plan evaluation form. So page 1 is missing there, but just kind of asking some questions about the processes in your plan. Does it work? Did you follow your plan? And it's basically set up, if you answer yes to everything, then your plan is probably good as is. If you answer no to anything, then you probably need to look at modifying your plan. All right, so I'm going to, since I have time, I'm going to go ahead and open this up on the website and show you. This is our main website. It's under the environmental program, and then stormwater operation and maintenance, and we'll provide this link in the follow-up emails. But this is the entire guide here. So if you just click on that, you'll open the guide. You see it's 111 pages in its entirety. But then each of the inspection checklists we provided as independent downloadable PDFs. Each one of them are fillable. So if you choose to use these, you can actually just fill it out, save it. You don't have to print it and fill it out manually. Just depends on the comfort level of the inspector doing the work. And then there's the other forms are here as fillable. So if you're gonna, for recording maintenance or recording how you evaluate your plan. And then here is the plan template. So it's a Word document, so it'll download. And I don't think you're not going to be able to see that because it's not in the screen sharing screen, but it's there for you to be able to download. All right, so I think with that, I am going to ask Rob if there are any questions.
Yeah, Kelly, I'm not seeing any questions pop up now. I am curious, so once these operating and maintenance plans are put together, do you recommend or suggest that they're recorded with any of the local municipalities?
So it depends on the requirements of the local municipality. If they are requiring the recording of maintenance agreements, it would become an exhibit to that maintenance agreement. At least the local municipality should require a plan to be attached to that maintenance agreement. The maintenance agreement would then be recorded on the deed of the property. So any change in ownership that would transfer over. So the plan would be attached to that. So if there are updates to the plan, that's another point where you'd need to notify your local municipality that you've made updates to the plan and make sure that's attached to that agreement.
All right, well, thank you. And I see we're doing pretty good on time here, but we will continue on to our next presentation. So introducing now Mara Garricky. Mara is the assistant planner at the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council, where she works with both the transportation and environmental programs. She holds a bachelor's of science in geography and city and regional planning from Grand Valley State, and is a current student at Penn State University, where she is studying geographic information systems. Prior to the MACC, Mara worked as a transportation planner in Kalamazoo and a GIS analyst in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Please welcome Mara Garricky.
Thank you, Rob. And I just want to verify that my screen is sharing.
Yep, everything looks good, Mara.
Okay, awesome. So thank you for that introduction. Like Rob mentioned, my name is Mara Garricky, and I am the assistant planner at the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council. And today I will be giving you an overview of our green stormwater infrastructure suitability mapping process. So this process and project was originally started back in 2017. So that was before I began at the MACC. And since coming on board, I have been tasked with sort of refining the GIS process and expanding it to reach a larger area. So I'm really excited to be presenting this today. So as a little bit of background, the MACC, with funding from the Community Foundation of the Holland Zealand area, developed a green stormwater vision for the Macatawa watershed in 2017. And this vision includes information about types of green stormwater infrastructure, relationships between water quality and transportation, a brief discussion of economics, and a strategy to implement the vision. And as a part of this vision, a GSI suitability GIS model for the watershed was developed. And in 2019, the GIS process was repeated to include all of Ottawa and Allegan counties. So the Green Stormwater Vision document, as well as the maps that I just mentioned for all of the cities and townships, can be found on the MACC website, and I'll be highlighting that later in my presentation. So the purpose of this model is to target GSI installation to specific parcels and to direct funding to the areas where it will have the greatest positive impact. And we'd also like to provide these results to local planning commissions, developers, and engineers to use as an initial screening tool for the inclusion of GSI projects. So the first step in the process was determining which criteria would be used to indicate suitability for GSI. So we first looked and reviewed a modified GIS model completed for Berlin, Maryland, and that link is at the bottom of this page. So in particular, we wanted to look at practices that relate to infiltration, such as rain gardens. So the study does not apply to practices like rain barrels and green roofs that don't really require infiltration. So criteria can be defined as factors that affect GSI suitability, and it was decided that we would use hydrologic soil group, natural drainage class, slope, and whether or not lakes and buildings are present to determine a parcel's suitability. And just as a quick note, the criteria can be easily added or deleted depending on the preferences of the organization that's running the model. All right, so this chart here details the suitability score for each of the criteria that was mentioned on the last slide. This table will provide us with a scoring system for determining the suitability of each parcel based on each of the criteria. So classifications are given a numerical value in order to make them comparable across the varying criteria. And this also allows them to be added together to get a final suitability score per parcel. So any criteria that makes for good green infrastructure implementation will be given a score of 3. Medium suitability will be given a score of 2. Anything that makes something not so suitable for green infrastructure will be given a score of 1, and if it's not suitable at all, it will receive a score of 0. So looking in particular at the hydrologic soil group, most types of green stormwater infrastructure, like in this study, are designed with infiltration in mind. Therefore, the higher the infiltration rate, the more suitable. So group A soils have a very high infiltration rate, making them ideal for GSI, while groups C and D have soils that are very slow when it comes to infiltration rates, making them unsuitable for green infrastructure. So moving on to drainage class, in excessively drained, somewhat excessively drained, and well-drained soils, water is removed rapidly, making them suitable for GSI practices that rely on infiltration. And on the opposite end, very poorly drained soils will typically have water that pool near the surface and would not allow for infiltration that's necessary for most green infrastructure practices. And then when it comes to slope, very low slope is not desirable because water will pool, and very high slopes are also undesirable because water might just bypass the feature completely. Therefore, a slope of 2 to 4.9% is considered the most desirable for GSI. And lastly, looking at structures, since many types, like I'd mentioned, of GSI encourage infiltration, features should be placed away from buildings so that water does not seep into foundations or basements. So in the end, all of these criteria are going to be put into a raster calculator. And this raster calculator works just like a regular calculator, where it'll add together the suitability scores for each of the cells where these different raster files line up. And then you will get a final GSI suitability score per cell, in which the parcel average can then be calculated. So the calculator will add together the score of each cell's hydrologic soil group value, the drainage class value, the slope value, the building footprint value, and the lake value to get the total GI suitability score for that cell, and then it can be averaged by parcel. Right, so before you get started, there are a few requirements you must have on your computer before beginning the process. So you must have ArcGIS Desktop 10.6.1 or higher installed, and you also must have the spatial analysis extension. It's also recommended that if you have access, you use your ArcGIS online account, because that'll be used to download a couple shapefiles that are already ready to be put into the model. So when you are acquiring your data, you're going to need an area of interest boundary. So that'll come in the form of a shapefile, and that can be anything that you want it to be. So you can look at a watershed, a city, a county, etc. And in this case, and for the rest of this presentation, we'll be focusing on Ottawa County, Michigan. So next up, you will download a hydrologic soil group and drainage class raster file from ArcGIS Online. And it's important to note that these are also available on the Web Soil Survey website, but the data that you download from the Web Soil Survey website must be heavily edited and manipulated to get it to work in ArcGIS. So in the instructional guide that's on our website that highlights every detail of this process, I believe that within that document there is some instruction on how to download the information from the website, but I'm not going to be covering that today. So you'll also need a parcel layer, which will be a shapefile, a lake layer, which will be a shapefile, and then an elevation or slope raster file. So if you have elevation data, it'll probably be in the form of LiDAR. And if you already have a raster file that is representative of slope, you are going to be able to bypass the entire elevation to slope process that I'll explain later. And lastly, it's optional to have a building footprint layer, and we will get into that in a bit, and that'll be a shapefile. So the majority of this work really revolves around data prep, and a lot of the layers are prepared in the same way. So when going through this process, it really doesn't matter which layer you prep first, but whenever I go through it, I usually prep the hydrologic soil group layer first. So I download the ArcGIS Online USA Soils Hydrologic Group raster file first, and then I clip it to the AOI. And in doing that, you just eliminate all of the unnecessary data, and it causes the GIS models to run so much faster that way. So throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll be using the word resample a lot. Resampling basically just changes the resolution of your raster data set, and each raster file must be of the same resolution when used in the raster calculator. So within each step, you're going to resample the raster file to a cell size of 4. And then lastly, like I'd mentioned, you will reclassify this layer based on suitability. So a soil group A with high infiltration and low runoff will receive a score of 3, all the way down to soil group D with very slow infiltration receiving a score of 1, which equals low suitability. And here are 2 images, one showing the hydrologic soil group before reclassification, and then another showing the soil hydrologic group after reclassification. And here you can see that all of the soil types are not classified, and here they are classified by suitability. So throughout the rest of the process, when you see green, that means it's highly suitable, yellow, medium suitability, orange, low suitability, and red is not suitable at all. So the next step is preparing the natural drainage class layer, and it's done exactly like the soil hydrologic group layer. So you'll download that from ArcGIS Online, and the file is called USA Soils Drainage Class, and I believe it is a file from Esri. You'll again clip it to your AOI and then resample to reduce the cell size to 4. You will then reclassify according to suitability. So those excessively, somewhat excessively, and well-drained soils will receive a 3, which is high suitability, all the way down to very poorly drained soils receiving a score of 0, which means they're not suitable at all. And here is a before and after of that drainage class reclassification. So moving on to slope, you might already have a slope raster file in hand, in which case this step would not apply to you. You could completely bypass this and just use your slope layer in the final raster calculator. But in our case, we had LiDAR data from a bunch of different townships in Ottawa County. So it was split up by township. And if you also have LiDAR data that's split up and you need to be able to combine it, what you're going to do is you're going to convert all layers to a 4-foot resolution using the resample tool like was done in the previous steps. And then you will combine all of those layers using the Mosaic to New Raster tool, which will just give you a nice, simple LiDAR data set with all of your layers combined. So you will then clip it to the new AOI and use the slope tool on the output/clipped raster to get the slope. And what the slope tool does is it identifies the steepness at each cell of a raster surface, and the lower the slope value, the flatter the terrain, and the higher the slope value, the steeper the terrain. You'll then reclassify slope according to suitability like mentioned before. So a slope of 2 to 4.9% earns it a score of 3, which is high suitability, all the way down to a score of 0, which is anything higher than 8%. And here is an image of the LiDAR data after it has been combined, and then an after photo of the slope after reclassification. So the process for excluding lakes and buildings is basically the same. So I'm just going to cover these 2 steps together. So there are alternative methods to this process, and those will be found in the instructional guide, but I'm going to go with the one that I most commonly use. So excluding lakes and buildings from any parcels that they may be present on is important to avoid skewing the final score, since GSI cannot occur in water or on buildings. To do this, you must use the union tool to combine the lake and building footprint shapefile with your AOI shapefile. And then once that's complete, you'll open the attribute table and select the line that's containing the AOI and export it as a shapefile. So what this will do is it'll create a new shapefile with the shape of your AOI, and the areas where lakes or buildings are present will no longer be there. It'll be kind of like a cookie cutter, and they'll be completely removed from the layer. So in those areas, there will be no data, therefore it doesn't affect the raster calculator. So anything that is classified as no data in a cell in one of the layers will result in a value of no data, and that is why they're created. So in the final output, those lakes and building footprints will not in any way affect the raster calculator. Also, I just want to note that if you don't have building footprints, you can skip this step. It's not absolutely necessary, but it is very helpful. So here's just an example of the combined building footprint and AOI area. And this shows you what it looks like to have those buildings cut out of the shapefile. So the second to last step is finally running the raster calculator. So what this does is it performs an addition function in each cell where raster files line up. And if there is no data in one of the raster layers, then there's a no data in the output, like I'd mentioned before. So now that each of the layers have been reclassified to reflect green infrastructure suitability scores, they can be added together to get a final green infrastructure suitability score. So you'll add your reclassified hydrologic group, drainage class, slope layer, lakes layer, and buildings layer. And this shows the raster calculator output as is, and then after reclassification. So the raster calculator output that's shown here is the result of adding all of the criteria scores in each cell together, with 3 being the highest suitability score awarded in each category. 9 is the highest suitability score that can be achieved after the raster calculation is performed, with 1 being the lowest. So a score of 7 to 9 will award a cell a high suitability score, 4 to 6 a medium, and 1 to 3 low. And this is, like I said, displayed in the second image. So the very last step of this process is using zonal statistics to determine the average suitability score per parcel. So as of now, the suitability is by cell. So we want to take a parcel and calculate the average suitability within that parcel to get a much cleaner image and have it be much more useful data in general. So the zonal statistics tool calculates the average of all rasters within a parcel, and then after that is complete, you'll reclassify it as everything had been reclassified in the previous steps to get a final map. So this map is Ottawa County, Michigan, and it's one of our final outputs, and it gives you a broader look at the overall analysis output. You can't really see the individual parcels, but you can see the overall sprawl of these different suitability scores. So overall, just by looking at it, it's pretty obvious that most are categorized as low suitability, but of course there are still so many parcels that do have the opportunity to have green stormwater infrastructure built on them. And this is a map of green stormwater infrastructure suitability for Zeeland, Michigan. So this is a clip a little bit closer up that gives you a better idea of what these scores look like within individual parcels. And so the MACC, when originally working on this project, in the end, this is an optional step. You can take all of this information and prioritize what kind of parcels you really want to look at and target for GSI suitability. So this was done separately from the suitability analysis, and it's really up to the organization who is completing this task to decide what kind of areas they'd like to target. So maybe they want to look at government buildings or schools or churches or a subwatershed. So that's optional, and that's really up to the user. So for some additional information, like I mentioned, all of this is on our website. So there you will be able to find the Green Stormwater Infrastructure Suitability Analysis Instructional Guide. And this guide is basically a step-by-step instruction manual on how to complete this process. So it's really great if you are interested in working on this yourself for a different region. It also includes the Green Stormwater Vision and PDF maps of all Allegan and Ottawa County cities and townships. So if you are from the area, you can find your map on our website. I'll just open that up right now to give you an idea of what it looks like. So if you scroll down, there's this really nice chart here that lists all of the maps by each county and each city. So you can find that there. And that is all I have for you. So I am open to taking some questions. And if you have any information, or if in the future you do decide to run this process, don't hesitate to reach out for some guidance on that. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Mara. We do have one question here in the chat.
Okay.
Are the suitability analysis calculations based on a specific research study?
Yes, so I'll go back to, let me see which slide. So the MACC, this was before my time here, so maybe Kelly can speak a little more to this. So the MACC actually developed our model on a GIS model that was completed for Berlin, Maryland. And once we send out the PowerPoint, you'll be able to link to it right here.
All right, thank you, Mara. And I'm not seeing any more questions at this time.
All right, thank you.
So, and again, if you do have any questions later on, we can see these in the chat, and we'll encourage panelists to chime in and answer when they can. And also feel free to contact anyone here at the MACC, Mara or Kelly, if you have any other questions. All right, so thank you all for attending the morning session. We will now take a break for lunch. The afternoon session will start with breakout rooms to offer a time to network with other attendees. And then we will continue with presentations and discussion. We hope that you will rejoin us this afternoon for sessions that will start promptly at 1 o'clock. See you all then. Thank you.